I was around 16 years old when this happened to me. It was just me and my dad at our house, and since he was a businessman that traveled quite frequently, I was left home alone quite often. First of all, I'll do my best to describe to you the layout of my house so you can better understand the situation. It's a fairly small place, since it was just my father, my dog, and I living in there. There was a long hallway full of full-sized windows separating my dad's room and mine. Our dog loved to look out of them, so we always kept them open enough for her to glance out of. I was in the last room at the end of the hallway. In between the two rooms was my bathroom and a spare room. Let's get right into it then. It was around 11 p.m. or so when the worst night of my life began. My dad was passed out in bed after a really long day of work, and I was mindlessly dancing around my house getting ready for bed. I hopped into the shower, not knowing what was coming ahead. Of course, like a cringe-worthy horror movie, my dog suddenly started aggressively barking up a storm. I decided, of course, to go out and explore by myself. I headed to my room to throw some clothes on first though, while my dog was still shitting bricks. Months before, I'm not exactly sure how, I'd somehow managed to break my door handle. You didn't have to twist the knob to open it anymore. All it needed was a gentle push. I was scared shitless when, after just having managed to put a shirt on, my dog opened the door herself. I looked to see her in my room, while in the midst of barking. That's when I looked out and saw it. There was only one window that had vision to the opening of my room. Just in the corner, I could see a person's face peeking in. Their face was so sinister, I can still see it in my mind years later. It was dark, so it took me a second to comprehend what I was seeing. When I finally realized, I screamed. My dad owned some guns, so when he heard me screaming, he ran out with his pistol loaded. He asked me what had happened, and I could barely mutter what I'd just seen. He ran outside to see if the man was still waiting around. We stood out there for a minute, scanning the area. All of a sudden, a man was casually strolling towards us from the opposite direction, about 100 yards away. I knew it was that very same man. I got that feeling in my stomach that you can never mistake. It was like he was trying to be so casual to cover up he had been there by coming from a different direction. They couldn't fool us though. "You better stay the fuck away from my daughter. You see what I have here? You know what this does?" He held up his gun. I could have sworn my dad was just going to shoot the man. The strange man brushed off these threats quite easily though, and didn't seem very bothered. "Fuck off, old man," he said, placing his hand in his pocket. My dad and I rushed back inside. The guy eventually went away, and it was almost like nothing had ever happened, but I still couldn't sleep a wink. I kept on thinking he was going to come back and hurt me because of those threats we'd made. We called the cops the next morning. They came and scoped out our house. The officer looked around trying to calm me down, but I was still pretty shaken up. He went out to the front yard, and that's when he noticed. In front of the windows in the long hallway, there were some small bushes, nothing much really. The cop from outside went to the window that had a view of where my room was. He tried to tell me the news without making me more upset, but he failed. There were indents in the dirt right in front of the window. That meant the guy knew exactly where he needed to look to see me. It seemed he had been there more than once as well, because there were various broken pieces of bush and divots in the ground. It turns out the guy was the nephew of my old neighbor. He had been staying there for months. Never arrested, never got in any trouble, barely got a slap on the wrist in the end. But at least he never bothered me after. How long had he been watching me exactly? I'll never know really. All I do know is I keep my door shut, and I never keep the blinds open now. This happened to me just yesterday. I was driving to my boyfriend Eric's house, which was about a 15-minute drive or so. As I was plodding along, I noticed that there seemed to be a car tailgating me. There was a Hispanic man driving a 90s sedan. As I reached Eric Street, the guy was still following me closely behind. I was not completely alarmed yet, but I was paranoid enough to not stop directly at Eric's house. Instead, I continued down to the end of the street. As I went to loop back around, I noticed that now the car was gone. Feeling a bit better, I pulled into the driveway and stepped out. As I was doing this though, the same car came out of a corner and drove by. He did not slow down or look at me or acknowledge me in any way though. Shrugging it off as just a coincidence, I went inside. A few hours later, Eric was in bed. I was watching TV. There's a large bay window opposite the couch, and you could see through a part in the blinds. Out of nowhere, I saw a movement out of the corner of my eye. The floodlight shined on, and the dog started to go insane. Eric did go to check, but he didn't find anything. We figured it was just a deer, and went to head to bed together. About 2 hours later, around 2 a.m., the dog starts to go ballistic again. I had never heard her go off like this, ever. Eric took a bat and the dog and went out the side door. It was level with the ground and opened directly into the kitchen. He searched around for a bit, then popped his head back in to tell me the backyard was clear. He was going to go check the front and made me lock the screen door, even though I was keeping the inside door open. I was standing with my head in the fridge, back to the door, when I heard what sounded like him trying to get in. I turned around laughing because he just told me to lock it, only to see it was not Eric. It was the guy who had been following me earlier. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me for a moment before trying to force his way in again. I screamed bloody murder. Eric and my dog came running around the side of the house. The man took off. We called the police, but they couldn't find him. They filed the report, but they said there was really nothing they could do unless we saw him again. I don't even want to think about what would have happened if that screen door hadn't been locked. We're staying at my house for the foreseeable future. When I was in 4th grade, my family was still living in Denver, Colorado, in a small condo near my school. My brother, a kindergartner at the time, and I only had to cross the street and walk between a couple of apartment buildings to get to the football field attached to our school. It was normally a pretty quick and safe trip to and from. My mother was taking night classes at NAU at the time, and her boyfriend, who we lived with, would usually watch us in the evenings. He usually wouldn't get off work until about 6:30 p.m. though. We grew up as latchkey kids, so this wasn't that big of a deal. One day, my brother and I were walking home together after school, like we'd usually do. We had just gotten onto the street in front of our home when a white car pulled right up in front of us. The man driving the car didn't seem like your typical weirdo. Maybe in his late 20s, he looked fairly clean cut. Looking back, the fact he was driving such a fancy car, a Benz I believe, and wearing such a crisp outfit didn't really fit with our neighborhood. The man asked my brother and I if our parents were home. Immediately, I got a serious sensation of stranger danger from this dude. I looked at our apartment across the street, then back at him. In the most I'm not stupid tone I could find, I asked him, "Why?" The man didn't even try to hide it. "It doesn't matter," he replied dismissively. "Are they home or not?" He seemed a little more insistent with his question and glanced around nervously. "Yeah," I said, despite knowing fully well they were not home, and my mom's boyfriend wouldn't be for another 2 hours. I figured it was better to lie in this situation. "Oh yeah? What are they doing?" he asked, really looking us over. I turned to my brother and ordered him to go with me, but he wouldn't follow me. I went to grab his hand, and he quickly withdrew it with a sharp no and looked back at the man. The guy then looked at both of us, then back at my brother. He made a facial expression that made my hair stand on end. He grinned and said, "Come closer. I have something for you." My brother started walking to the door of the car. The man was just reaching his hand out, like he was about to grab him. I grabbed my brother's coat and started hauling him towards our apartment, as fast as I could manage. He was screaming at me to let him go, but I was so terrified I just kept dragging him along. The guy quickly put his car into gear and looked like he was thinking about going after us before peeling out of there as quickly as possible. My mother's friends started picking us up from school after that, and a PSA was issued to the community. I still get a little bit creeped out when cars slow down near me when I'm outside walking. About 2 years ago, I worked at a movie store inside a mall. I've had tons of strange experiences with customers, but this one definitely tops them all. I was about 20 at the time. This guy, over 6 foot, late 40s, very hefty, and always with this weird zombified expression on his face, came in about once a week. One of my coworkers even warned me about him, how he was a little bit off. I still treated him with as much respect as I did everyone else though. One day he came in and we talked for a bit. It got a bit awkward, of course, and I kept trying to end the conversation and looked busy by tagging items behind the counter. When he couldn't find anything else to say to continue the conversation, he just stood there in silence, watching me for 30 minutes, then finally left. A few days later he came back in and walked right up to me, holding a large container. "I made 4 pounds of enchiladas at home today, just for you. I remembered you like Mexican food." Funny thing is, I didn't remember telling him that I liked that. I did go to the Mexican restaurant across the way every lunch break though. I just politely accepted and put it in the back office. I was convinced he'd used his jizz for it or something. Another few days later, he came back in and had a drawing for me. A drawing of a dragon. Now, dragons are my favorite thing in the world, but of course, I'd never told him that either. This drawing looked like it took hours to make. At this point, I was a little bit freaked out. I had him leave it on the counter so I could just throw it away later. Further on, I was given about a week of vacation. During that week, I cut my hair about 12 inches. The day I came back, I got a shift with my manager. I told her all about that guy, and immediately she was weirded out for me. No shit. A few minutes later, I see that guy wandering around the mall. He was going towards the exit and didn't look at me once. My manager told me to go to the back office. I went and waited until she came to get me. When she did, she told me I needed to make a report to mall security immediately. Apparently, when I ran back there, he turned around to come in and walked all throughout the store. When she asked him if he needed help with something, he said, "I can't believe she cut her hair," and walked briskly out. I got to the mall security office to make a report, and we went through all the videos from the cameras of when the guy came to visit me. There was one particular video that really stood out that I'd never noticed before. It still sends chills throughout my body just thinking about it. The video showed him pulling into the parking lot of the mall. About 3 minutes before I arrived. This was really early in the morning, and no customers were there yet. I didn't notice the man at all. It showed him walking towards the entrance, and then him following behind me. Right as I was opening the entrance door, the man started sprinting towards me. I just so happened to walk inside right in time. It showed him stopping behind me, just standing silently in front of the door and watching me through the glass before walking around the corner. He waited for about 5 minutes, then walked normally back inside the mall. I'd never noticed him behind me. That part really fucked me up. It was like watching the last footage before a kidnapping or murder on Dateline or something. The video gave security every reason to ban him from the mall, and they did. They also later told me they gave him a background check, and he had 4 counts of child pornography on his person. He happened to be on probation. This happened to me when I was 11 or 12 years old, over a decade ago. I still remember it quite vividly. At the time, I lived in a semi-detached house with my mom, dad, and sibling. It was decent sized, but the most impressive part was the garden, which essentially had 3 levels. The first level was concrete, the second grass, and the third also grass. That one had my trampoline on it. At the very end of the garden was a tree embankment. The area I lived in was somewhat hilly. One morning, I woke up to a cracking sound, like a snapped branch almost. I was worried since a week earlier a tree from the embankment had fallen onto our neighbor's garden. My bedroom was right at the back of the house overlooking the area, so I opened the curtains to see if another tree was going to fall down. Instead, I looked out and saw a man hiding in the canopy of one of the trees in the garden. He was pale with blonde hair, wearing all black clothing. He was looking directly at me, presumably because he'd seen the curtains move. He smirked at me and moved his finger in a come here motion. I freaked out and shouted for my mom and dad to come to my aid. I was so scared I physically felt like I couldn't move. This was super early in the morning, by the way, around 5 a.m. or so. It took my dad a good 30 seconds to get into my room, at which point the stranger had completely hidden himself amongst the trees. I was really shaken up. I was crying whilst I told my dad what just happened. He went out into the backyard to see if he could spot the guy, but he was long gone by that point. A bit of time passed by after, and I'd started to forget about the incident. Then, about 3 months later, my mom and I were watching TV together after I'd just finished up a bit of school. The doorbell rang, and my mom went to answer the door. I looked out of the window of the living room where we were sat, and just so happened to see a white van parked outside. It was the same van as my uncle drove, so I walked out of the living room and into the hallway to greet him. When I got to the porch where my mom was stood though, I realized it was not my uncle. It was the very same guy I had seen in the garden a few months prior. It really freaked me out. He noticed me as well as I walked behind my mom. He gave me the same smirk he'd given me that first time. I wanted to say something to my mom, but I couldn't. I was freaking out inside, and I had no idea what he would do. Anyway, he just asked my mom if she wanted work done on the drive. She said no, and the man left, hopped back in the van, and drove off. He didn't give her a business card, the van didn't have any company branding, and he didn't knock on any of the neighbors' doors. I told my mom it was the same man as soon as he'd gone, and she started to feel uneasy about the situation too. A month or so after, I got my first job doing paper rounds. I had to deliver over 300 papers with my best friend at the time. It was getting towards winter, and so it got dark by 4:30 p.m. We had been doing the job together for around a month or so, when the evening after school one day, it was dark and rainy. We were halfway through delivering the papers when a van started tailing us, driving really slow, at the same pace we were going. We clocked that it was following us after a minute or so, and we started to panic, as I noticed it was the very same man once again. We left the newspaper trolley behind and started walking quite quickly up the hill. We were about a 10-minute walk away from my house. I rang my mom in a panic, who made me stay on the line while she left the house to meet us. She told us to go to the corner shop that we were about a minute away from. When we made it to the shop, the van sped off really fast. The police were called, who came to my house for a report. We told them everything. That was the last time I ever saw that creepy stranger, but I still remember what he looked like so vividly. This happened quite some years ago. I was around 20 or so, I think. I was going on a road trip of a sort with a really good friend of mine and his family. Our destination was a concert in a country next to ours. We would be stopping at night though to sleep in the camper we drove in. We hadn't yet crossed the border when we stopped at the first campsite for the night. Now, it seemed like a pretty family-friendly and safe place, so none of us really had our guards up. That night at about 11 p.m. or so, while my friend and his family were getting ready for bed, I went outside to get some fresh air. Our camper was almost completely next to the beach, so I went down to the shoreline to dip my feet and get some much-needed quiet time to myself. On the way there, I happened to pass by a beach shack, a detail that will be important. As I stood there letting the waves lap over my feet, I noticed the silhouette of a man further down the beach. It was a public space open for campers though, so I didn't really think too much of it. After being absorbed by splashing in the water with my feet and enjoying the moonlight, I decided to make my way back. It was very dark, of course, given the late hour. I wasn't really scared, though. As a woman in the modern world, I tend to stay on guard after dark, but that thought never occurred to me in this situation. I felt like I was in a safe environment, so close to the campsite. I was walking back when I noticed that the silhouette of the man further down the beach was now gone. Even more worrying, though, was the fact that as I neared that beach shack, I saw that someone seemed to be trying to hide from my view behind it. Immediately, I went on high alert. I called my friend I knew would still be awake. I gave the shack a wide berth as well, talking loudly to my friend about how she was coming to meet me. After not too long, I got safely back to the campsite and hopped in bed in the caravan. I didn't tell my friend or his family because even though I was scared, there could have been many logical, non-threatening answers to what I'd seen. I tried to put it out of my mind, and the rest of the trip went off without a hitch. About a year or so later, I was talking to my friend about the trip and suddenly remembered that creepy experience. As I told him, he slowly got pale and told me something his brother had mentioned to him and his family over breakfast some months after the trip had happened. That same night, after I'd gotten back and gone to bed, his brother had gotten up late at night to get some water. As he passed by the window right by my bed, he saw a man standing right there outside, looking down at me through the window. As soon as he was seen, the man ran away. It definitely creeped out the brother quite a lot. Just like me, though, he seemed to put it out of his mind. With both those stories, it doesn't seem far-fetched that the man hiding by the beach shack had followed me back to the camper. I'm really scared to think about what would have happened had I been there all alone.